definitely is a little bit lighter than the sample board we made up. You notice that?
Yeah, but what do you think now that we're working with something bigger than the 2x2?
I think we should work it just a little bit more to get rid of some of these individual sponge imprints. Just kind of work that in a little bit.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Well, welcome to Home Time. On today's program, we're going to show you some different ways of decorating your walls. We're going to be showing you some different wallpapering applications. In fact, a total of 3 of those. And we're also going to be working with some full finishing techniques. In fact, that's where we're going to start the program today. We're going to be discussing the pros and cons of painting with a sponge.
Home Time is made possible by the Stanley Works of New Britain, Connecticut. For generations, Stanley's been committed to building tools, doors, hardware, and fastening products to help you do things right. And by the Sterling Plumbing Group, manufacturers of faucets and fixtures for today's American home. And by Valio, makers of back support belts that help the do-it-yourselfer tackle home improvement projects.
You done with that one? Okay. Well, the sponge painting technique isn't quite as easy as it looks. Most people think you get a sea sponge, dab some paint on it, start working over your wall here, and you just automatically end up with something that looks gorgeous. Well, it isn't quite that easy. And what's interesting is it's this technique that has just about become the generic term for full finishing. When really this is just one of the applications.
Now, actually, the full finishing experts that we worked with say that when you're using a sponge, it's really hard to get consistent results. That's because if there's a golden rule in this business, it's to disguise your tool. And you don't want to make it too obvious how you created the effect. And with a sponge, it's real difficult because the look is so distinctive. So the best procedure for using the sponge technique is to start out with a very light base coat. Now, we used an off-white latex with an eggshell sheen. And now we're putting 2 different colors on top of that.
I'm going to start with the darkest color for the base. You want to use the flat, large section of the sponge to do this. You start dabbing it on to the wall here, and you want to use kind of a random pattern as you put it up. You want to do what they call opening and closing the door. You move the sponge back and forth so it doesn't look like you're just repeating the same pattern all over. And you don't want to have real straight vertical lines either. You want to kind of move that around. But what you don't want to do is just be bouncing all over the wall either. This way you get a much more consistent feel as you move through the whole process. When you get down to the bottom, make sure you get your pattern fairly tight into the trim too, so that doesn't look detached from the rest of the job. Now I'll move on to the gray color, which is slightly lighter. Now here's how you get paint on the sponge. You dip it very gently into the paint. You get just a little bit on the bottom of the sponge. Then you want to offload it. There's a couple of things. One is it evens out the paint on the bottom of the sponge, but it also gets it so you don't have great big globs of paint that will smear all over the wall. And then go up here and, like with the burgundy color, and just start opening and closing the door again, moving that pattern around.
Well, I'm working with the 3rd color now, which is the lightest, and it's also the same color as the base. Now, in other words, so far, I've worked from the darkest color on the bottom to the lightest color on top. And again, it's just random movements. I'm not trying to cover anything, I'm just adding another layer to the texture. Okay, and every once in a while you need to just step back and reassess the whole picture. What do you think?
Well, I think we're still a little bit light right in this area right there.
Okay, a little less intense than over there. What if I put some more burgundy there?
Well, probably one of the tougher things about sponge painting is dealing with the corners. One problem you have is it's real hard to get random movements with a sponge. The other thing is the sponge is just kind of big and bulky. It's hard to get in the corners, so you end up with this white line here. Definitely one of the tougher things about sponge painting. Still, we wanted to show you this technique so you got an idea of what's involved in doing a room.
And actually, once these areas are dried, we're just going to roll over it and do a different type of faux finishing. I mean, that's the beauty of any kind of faux finishing, especially if you do it yourself. So if you redecorate or the colors you use go out of style, you can just roll over it and do something else.
Now we're going to demonstrate a parchment glaze. Now this is real simple to do, and it doesn't have all the drawbacks that you get with sponge painting. but you do have to use an oil-based paint to create the effect.
And the reason they call this glaze is because we actually add glazing liquid to the paint. Now basically, glazing liquid is paint without the color. And glazing liquid allows us to shear out the paint, so it gives us longer working time without weakening the color or durability. Now we also add thinner to this mixture, 1 part. So it's 1 part paint, 1 part glazing liquid, and 1 part thinner. Now ultimately, you want the consistency to be of a light cream. Okay, do you want a paint or do you want a texture?
I still have some cheesecloth to get ready here. You want to start rolling it out?
Sure.
Okay.
To keep a consistent look to the project, I'm going to apply the paint on the wall, and Dean's going to push it around to give it the texture. I'm rolling the glaze on in random diagonal streaks. And then I use a brush to work it into the corners where I can't reach with a roller. Okay, how's that? Good enough for you?
Yeah, that looks pretty good. And once you get all the paint rolled on there, you just want to take your cheesecloth and roll it up into a little bit of a powder puff. Make sure you get all the tails tucked in underneath here. You want to have a nice flat surface with no edges showing. And the first thing you want to do is just start spreading out the paint to the different areas. And you want to do this as evenly as you possibly can. And once you get the paint distributed, then I just kind of start dancing around with my cheesecloth. Now you notice that I'm leaving a wet edge over on this side. Just kind of move around here, and this bouncing around with the cheesecloth is what actually creates the texture. Now you don't want to get it too even. There's kind of a delicate balance between getting it too even and having too much texture. So you just want to kind of work it in a little bit. Kind of move around like that. You gonna get that there? Goes pretty fast, doesn't it? This is pretty intense work. You really have to keep moving. This is no time to take a coffee break. You have to just keep on rolling until you get to the end of the wall. Okay, maybe just a little bit more up here, Robin.
Okay. Over in here. We used a flat paint when we mixed up the glaze. Now that it's dried a little bit, the shine has gone off the surface and it's toned down the effect a little bit. Now, if you want a subtler effect, you can use a paint that's closer to the base coat of the wall.
I wasn't kidding before when I mentioned that you really do have to move through this. In fact, we finished up this entire room in only a little over an hour. And in the process, I kind of forgot to mention that when you buy cheesecloth, you want to get 90 weight. Now, when you're moving that quickly, there are bound to be areas that you might want to come back and redo. For us, it got a little dark up here. I mean, I'd love to have the chance to go back and redo that again.
Yeah, and over in this area, I think we just worked it too long.
Yeah, that's
it's too even.
a little flat.
But everything else around it looks pretty good. I think there's just the right amount of variation, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. And again, what we were going after was a parchment look. We want this to look like old parchment paper. And it's just a real quality appearance. Later on in the show, we're going to be installing some wallpaper down here underneath the chair rail, and has a color that picks up the color of the full finish perfectly.
But before we tackle that job, we're going to review some wallpaper basics. We're going to be doing a more traditional wall covering in here, wallpaper. Now, everyone's hung wallpaper from time to time. It's definitely one of the most popular do-it-yourself projects. So we're not going to bore you with all the step-by-step details on how it's done. Instead, we're going to show you how to deal with some of the most common mistakes that homeowners make.
Well, we went ahead and got all these walls prepped here. Now, this is one thing people really tend to overlook. You have to seal your walls before you do any wallpapering. If you don't, what'll happen is once you get the wallpaper on, it'll tend to bond with the drywall. The only way you'll get the wallpaper off down the road is to start ripping into the drywall. Many times what people do is they'll walk into a room, they'll throw on a coat of sizing and feel they're all set to go. Well, sizing doesn't seal off the wall. That's why we're using a primer sealer to make sure we're getting the job done.
Well, here's some of the paper that we'll be using in this room. We needed a lighter color in here, and this has got a cream background. We really like this color in the medallions. Plus, the pattern really adds life to the walls. Now, you're going to run into a lot of terms when you start looking for wallpaper, and some of them can be kind of confusing. Now, this label says it's a pre-pasted, peelable, washable vinyl paper, which is a fairly common type of wallpaper. Grab this piece. Well, we got a pretty good start papering in this room. We started in that corner and got about halfway down this wall, but this area is not too tough. We don't have any windows or anything else to paper around. Now, as you'll probably notice, I'm going to leave a little bit left over on the top. I'll go ahead and trim that off as soon as I get this on the way I want it. Okay, pull this off and put it back on. Okay, that looks good. Now, one point I want to make is when you're lining up your seams, when the paper's all on the wall, you don't want to push it over with your fingers like that. You want to lift it off about halfway or 3/4 of the way and then push it over and line up your seams. Otherwise, you're stretching the paper. When the paper dries, it'll shrink away from the seams.
Now, we're not going to try to show you every type of wallpaper there is on the market. And you're basically just going to have to read the instructions to find out what the differences are. And probably one of the areas you'll find some differences in how long it takes the wallpaper to book. Now, we like to let most wallpaper book about 5 to 10 minutes. Again, we're talking pre-pasted wallpaper. Now, another thing is wallpaper has a tendency to swell. In fact, it may swell as much as 1/4 of an inch over the width. Now, you want that process to happen while it's here on the table, not once you have it up on the wall where it could end up buckling the paper or have the pattern not match up. So between the two of us, we like to have enough pieces booking here while we're working on the other ones.
You need a good sharp razor and a taping knife to trim the ends off of the paper. You should end up with a nice tight fit right along the baseboard. Now's a good time to wash off any paste left on the baseboard, along with any that might have gotten on the paper itself.
All right, well, I've got the pattern matched up here along the edge, and most of it is fairly flat right up against the window. Now, once I hit the window, obviously, I have to do some cutting along here. So the first thing I'll do is get this tight up against the casing, find the top of the casing with my finger, and then there I'll make a diagonal cut. Okay, and then I just go down to the bottom and do the same thing down there. Make my diagonal cut very carefully, and then get everything in place. I'm not going to trim off any of this paper here until I get everything else kind of into position. And I'll go back and do that. Then you want to trim along the window here the same way we did along the baseboard and the ceiling. You want to keep your knife good and perpendicular to the wall. You don't want to do it at an angle like that because it doesn't have a hard surface to go against, and you could end up ripping the wallpaper because it slides underneath the trim. There we go. Well, you know what I'm talking about if you've ever wallpapered before. You're coming down the wall, everything's going great, and then you hit the corner, and things can get a little screwed up. Well, that's because not all walls are perfectly plumb. There's an old saying that goes, the paper's always straight, but the wall's always crooked. If you continue the wallpaper around the corner using the same plumb line, if the wall is slightly out of kilter, the pattern will start going one way or the other. So the best thing to do is cut off the wallpaper in the corner, draw a plumb line, and then wallpaper back in that direction. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So what I did is I cut this piece just a little bit longer so it could wrap around the corner about 1/4 of an inch. Now that left me with a remnant about 6.5 inches wide. So what I'll do is measure out from here 6.5 inches, mark that, and then using my trusty level here, drawing a plumb line from the ceiling down to the base. Okay, so get this up into position here. And this little overlap here around the corner will help hide any inconsistency in our wall evenness here. Well, the pattern is working out pretty well up in this area of the ceiling here, and that isn't something that happened by accident. We wanted the ceiling to fall in between these rows of medallions. If we had the medallions right up against the ceiling, we were cutting them off. Most ceilings are fairly uneven. As we go across the ceiling, those medallions would become larger and smaller and really telegraph the fact the ceiling isn't real even. So that works out good up there. We just about ended up clipping off the medallions underneath the soffit. Again, another area where we didn't want to have the medallions bumping right up against the bottom. So the way we kept that from happening is we pulled our pattern down here as far as possible so that those avoid the soffit to the point where we just about had the medallions sticking down here from the upper row, but fortunately we were able to avoid that. We also figured out where all the seams were going to go before we started. We targeted an area where we were going to locate the first piece, and we took the width of the wallpaper and measured around the entire room to find out where the seams would land. What we want to avoid are real thin strips in either the corners or around windows. They're just too difficult to deal with. So up front, it gives us an opportunity to adjust exactly where the first piece does go to eliminate that problem down the road.
Well, this is probably the most overused tool by do-it-yourselfers. Most people tend to roll out the seams too much. So besides flattening them out, they're just rolling out all the adhesive from underneath. And then when the paper dries, the seams tend to curl up. So you don't want to use this tool any more than you have to. As a matter of fact, we had one wallpaper expert recommend that we don't use this at all. He suggested that we use our smoothing tool to kind of tap the seams instead.
Well, we're just about done with this room. Now, we did end up with a mismatch over our door there, but by the time you bring your pattern around the room, you're bound to have one area where everything doesn't exactly tie together. But it is above the door, so it's not that terribly noticeable. Robin, you ready for your next one here? There you go. Now, what we did is left this soffit for last. This way we can fill in some of our scraps up there.
We also wanted to try to match the pattern on the ends, and we figured we'd probably have a mismatch on one end. We couldn't get that lucky as to perfectly match up both ends. Now this corner is the most noticeable in the room since it's directly across from the door. So we want our mismatch to be on the other side.
Well, who knows, maybe we will get lucky. I don't know.
Even if we don't, I don't think it'll be too noticeable. This is a pretty small part.
Yeah.
We thought this would be a nice effect with the paper. Really goes well with the faux finish on top. Breaks up the wall and introduces a whole new pattern to the room. Now we picked out this color to match the darker stripe in the paper and the chair rail color to match the lighter stripe. And we really don't have to worry about a mismatch in this room because the paper just dead ends wherever there's a doorway. So we just started one corner over there. We're just working our way around the room this way.
With this wall covering, we're working with a random match, which is easiest type to work with because you can pretty much match it anywhere along the length. You ready for another one?
Yep.
Okay. There you go.
Thanks. And these shorter pieces are easier to work with. But I do have an outlet to work around, so I'll show you how to do that. First, you want to get the piece up there all the way around the outlet like this, okay? Then I'll just smooth it out right up to about where the outlet starts. Okay. You want to make sure the power's off before you do this, just in case you come in contact with the hot wire. I like to cut as tight around the outlet as possible at first. You don't want to cut out too much, otherwise the wall plate won't cover it. And you'll have to start with a new piece of wallpaper. Now I can go ahead and smooth the rest of it out, get it into place. Okay. Okay, and then at this point I can trim out a little more, give us room to work in case we ever need to replace this outlet.
Now here's one thing you might want to try. If your wallpaper is wide enough to span the distance from the baseboard up to the chair rail, you could run it horizontally. The nice thing here is you won't have any seams running from one edge of the wall down to the other. I've heard this referred to as railroading. It also works pretty well in soffit areas. The only thing is you need the right type of pattern. Solid colors are great, plaids work fine, but I don't think we'll try it here on our vertical stripes. Okay, get this piece in here. Well, just when we thought we were done taking off wall coverings, we're back at it here. And what we're doing is removing a fairly heavy fabric wall covering. In fact, I should get a little bit more water on this one.
It seems like it's drying out a little bit. And we're using a garden sprayer filled with hot water to soak down this fabric, and it's also got some wall covering removal additive in it.
Now, it's coming off fairly well. but at the same time, it's still difficult not to peel off some of the drywall in the process, which is fine because we'll just go ahead and skim coat that with some drywall mud, and then we'll seal over the top of it. Okay, I think I'll let that soak in a little. Well, in the meantime, I'll show you the new wall covering product we're going to be using. Well, basically what we've got here is woven glass yarn, and it's pretty much like fiberglass. The threads are really long, so you don't have a bunch of little individual hairs popping up all over the place. And the way they weave it allows you to use tons of different designs and styles. But then once it's up, you paint over the top of it. So you get the texture of cloth, but you have any color you want. And there's a real variety of textures. You can get different sorts of weaves. We're going to be going with this diamond pattern. In fact, there's a larger version of it right here that's going up on the wall. Well, anyway, there's a lot of interesting features about this product, and we'll tell you about some of them when we start to put it up on the walls. Well, once we get the rest of this wall covering off, at any rate.
Well, there's a couple of things about hanging our glass textile wall covering that's different from regular wallpaper. One thing, it's not pre-pasted. You have to apply an adhesive, and you have to make sure to apply the right type, which is a heavy-duty clear adhesive. Now, we apply it to the wall with a 3/4-inch nap roller. It really doesn't hurt to put it on pretty thick, and you only want to put it on one width of fabric at a time.
Well, this material is incredibly stable. You don't have to worry about it shrinking or expanding with temperature or moisture. Okay, Robin, watch out. I'm going to drop this down. Okay. So you can work with it right off the roll. You don't have to soak it prior to putting it up on the wall. But it does have a 10-inch repeat. So you want to make sure that you leave enough here at the top so you can match up the pattern on the last sheet you put up without it becoming too short on the top or the bottom. But from this point here, the installation basically works like regular wallpaper. And we just line the pattern up here at the seam. Now it helps because this material has lines running through it, so you can line those up as well. Now you want to remember this material has a front and back to it. We want to work with a side that's rolled in on the roll. That's the part that will stick out. And we trim the top of this like we do any other type of wallpaper. That's pretty strong stuff, so you want to make sure you've got a fresh blade for each cut. Of course, its strength is one of its big assets. That's probably why it's used so often in commercial settings. Now, this material is too thick to overlap at the corners. So when I cut this piece to width, I did just a little bit wider. And once I get it up here, just use my broad knife and cut this to the exact size in the corner.
For this next piece, we drew a plumb line. Here, I'll demonstrate how we're going to do this. We're going to put the left side to it, and we're going to do it in such a way that the other side overlaps the first piece by a tiny, tiny bit. And then we're just going to cut the second piece the same way.
Okay, let me get some glue up in there.
Okay, I'll get out of your way. And by trimming both sides tight into the corner, we're accomplishing a couple of things. We're keeping all the pieces perfectly plumb all the way around the room. And we're also keeping the pattern consistent here in the corner. We're not overlapping any pieces. So we end up with a nice tight seam right in the middle of the corner.
Now, we're in the process of putting our first coat of paint on our glass textile wall covering. Eventually, we will be putting 2 coats on. Let me get this by you here once. We just want to make sure that we seal everything up real good, and then we get real good color coverage.
You should put the paint on pretty thick. In fact, since the surface has got so much texture on it, you should use a roller cover with about a 1-inch thick nap. Okay. You can see that with a layer of this wall covering and a couple of coats of paint, you can totally transform almost any surface.
Well, this wall covering is so strong, you can actually use it to reinforce walls. That's why it works great on old plaster walls with a lot of cracks. Well, we've seen it used on old plywood paneling. In fact, you can put it on just about anything. And we've been told it's becoming one of the most popular types of wall coverings in Europe.
Anyway, that'll do it for the show today. We hope you've gotten some ideas on what you can do to finish off your walls and some helpful hints on how you can do it yourself.
Thanks for watching.
Home Time is made possible by the Stanley Works of New Britain, Connecticut, makers of sliding and bifold mirrored doors and closet organizers. Stanley helps you do things right, all over the house. And by the Sterling Plumbing Group, manufacturers of faucets and fixtures for today's American home. And by Valio, makers of back support belts that help the do-it-yourselfer tackle home improvement projects.
A complete copy of the Home Time wall coverings program is available on video cassette. The price is $11.95. To order this or any other Home Time tape, call 1-800-531-5599.
This is PBS.
Quick Steps, a video companion to Home Time, is available for $12.95 plus shipping. This 2-hour collection features over 110 minute-long segments from 14 Home Time episodes, edited for quick reference by the home do-it-yourselfer. From ceramic tile, decks, and kitchens to drywall and electrical, you'll find the information. To order Quick Steps, please call 1-800-877-6644.
to a birthday bash.
Hurry, 'cause the place is filling up.
Congratulations, Newton's Apple, for 10 years of making science fun and exciting.
Newton's Apple is made possible by a grant from 3M, encouraging innovative ways of looking at the world around us. 3M, innovation working for you. And now, here's your host, David Heil.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome to Newton's Apple, the program that answers your questions about science, technology, and the world around us. Our first question concerns riverboats, and the river made famous by author Mark Twain, the mighty Mississippi. Lisa Coleman of Boulder, Colorado asked us, how do giant boats travel up and down the Mississippi without running aground? Well, when field reporter Peggy Knapp set out on the river, she found that changing water levels are a concern for any skipper traveling this historic river.
The mighty Mississippi River flows 2,552 miles from its source in Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico at a rate of 100 trillion gallons per year. The vast strength and scope of the Mississippi make it an ideal transportation link, but harnessing the river's power has not been an easy task.
Any fan of boating will tell you that navigating on the river has its challenges. During periods of shallow water, it's not hard to, say, end up run aground, for example. That's why engineers throughout history have worked on methods for controlling the river's currents to help boaters avoid hazards like these.
Shallow water was a major problem on the upper portion of the Mississippi until the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed a series of 29 locks and dams from Minneapolis to St. Louis. These navigation dams keep at least 9 feet of water in the river channel so that large commercial towboats and barges can safely travel the upper Mississippi. To learn how a navigation dam works, I toured a site with engineer Bonnie Montgomery.
A navigational dam's purpose is only to control the river levels during low flow. It has two parts. It has the lock, which allows the traffic or the boats to pass through, and it has the dam part, which controls the pool levels upstream of the dam during low flows.
Most of the upper Mississippi navigation dams are made up of a series of concrete piers with movable gates between them. Raising and lowering the gates controls how much water flows through the dam.
When you start controlling the flow, what effect does that have on the river?
As we lower the gates, we create slack water pools upstream, and during really low flows, extremely low flows, it's more like a lake upstream than it is a river.
Instead of flowing in a slope, the river becomes more like a stairway of lake-like pools when the gates at every dam are lowered. Under high water conditions, the gates are raised completely out of the water. The river then flows freely through the dams, and the water surface returns to a natural slope. Every day, engineers monitor the river flow and calculate how to position the gates in order to maintain the proper water level. The adjustments made on the 19 gates at this dam are supervised by lockmaster Frank Ewell.
Okay, let's say I have to lower that gate a little bit. There's too much water going through. How do I do that?
Well, then you would simply walk over here and hit the lower button, and then you would watch your gauge. When you've lowered 2 feet or whatever you're over here to do, then you would hit the stop button and stop.
Oh, that's the gauge I'm looking at?
Right.
Okay. So I just push the lower button?
Right.
The button starts a motorized drum. This unwinds the chains, which slowly lower the 30-ton gate into the water.
How much water am I going to be controlling by cutting that down 2 feet?
Well, 2 feet today would be going about 1,800 cubic feet per second.
I'm I'm doing a lot with this water. I have a lot of control about
You
this
bet.
water.
Well, that's what we're here for. I mean, that's our purpose, is to maintain this 9-foot channel.
The water level drop or head at each dam poses an obvious obstacle for traveling boats, so locks were built to act as elevators that carry boats from one pool level to the next. I visited a dam with a 38-foot head and gained a new appreciation for the boost that locks provide. I got a chance to take over the controls, and lockmaster Joe Dvorak showed me the basics of lock operation.
And you're doing just great. Gates are moving.
Now, is there a way I could do this wrong?
Joe assured me that the beauty of the lock design is its virtually foolproof simplicity. The lock gates were built in a miter, or V, facing into the river current. If there's a head upstream, the pressure of the higher water will keep the gates closed, eliminating the risk of letting water through accidentally.
Okay, now what will this barge do?
Okay, now you need to let him know that we're ready. So you give him a green light. Lower green. Downstream green. Which tells him we're ready to lock through.
What happens next is really just simple hydraulics. A boat traveling downstream enters the lock when the chamber is full. After the boat is inside and the gates are closed, a valve is opened to release the water through a system of pipes and into the lower part of the river. No pumps are required. The force of gravity causes the water to seek its own level, meaning the water stops draining when it matches the level in the lower pool, and the boat can then continue on. So what happens when you're traveling upstream? Joe let me experience it firsthand.
Looks really great from inside.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's really impressive.
An upstream lockage is the same process in reverse. Once we were securely inside the chamber, an operator opened a valve on the upstream end of the lock to let water in from the upper pool. Remember, the water isn't pumped in. This floating elevator runs on gravity. Filling or emptying the lock usually takes about 15 minutes. That's pretty fast considering that the chamber measures 56 by 400 feet and holds about 6 million gallons of water. The dams have brought positive changes to river travel, but they've also had a big effect on the river ecosystem. The land next to the river, called the floodplain, was once flooded only during high water periods.